Welcome, fellow explorers. My name is Christian Alexanderson, and this is Hemlocks to Hellbenders, a podcast highlighting Pennsylvania's parks, forests, and great outdoors. For generations, Pennsylvanians have been at the forefront of conservation movements that have shaped the United States. Pennsylvanians like Gifford Pinchot, Joseph Rothrock, J. Horace McFarland, and Rachel Carson have had immeasurable impacts on our natural world. They've helped protect our forests, create state parks, beautify our cities, and warn against the devastating effects of pesticides. Others like Ralph Brock and Mira Lloyd have often been left out of the history books due to discrimination, but finally, their voices and work are being raised up. From the indigenous tribes that inhabited the lands we now call Pennsylvania to the activists that helped pass the Environmental Rights Amendment to our Constitution, Pennsylvania has a long and storied history of conservation. Pennsylvania is home to a lot of firsts. America's first botanical garden was built near Philadelphia in 1728. America's first natural history museum was created by Charles Wilson Peale in 1784. Pennsylvania passed one of the earliest air pollution laws in 1881. The Pennsylvania State Forest Academy was one of the first forestry schools in the country. Pennsylvania trained the first African-American forester in the United States. And Pennsylvania is home to the world's first refuge for birds of prey. It's something to be proud of. It's something to highlight, and it's something to celebrate. I find that the more time I spend outside enjoying our incredible public lands, the more I want to learn about our history of conservation. But where's a good place to start? Where can I learn a lot without getting bogged down in timelines and jargon? For me, there's been no better guidebook than Allen Dieterich-Ward's Cradle of Conservation, an environmental history of Pennsylvania. Released in 2024, this book is a comprehensive study of Pennsylvania's environmental history in less than 150 pages. This concise book unpacks the people, policies, and pivotal moments that turned Pennsylvania into a leader in conservation. Whether you're a history buff, a nature lover, or just someone who enjoys a good story about the great outdoors, this book is for you. But don't take my word for it. Here's what Cindy Adams Dunn, the Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, had to say about the book. Quote, "In this sweeping yet succinct account, Allen Dieterich-Ward brings to life Pennsylvania's environmental history, from the birth of the conservation movement in the 19th century to the impacts of climate change we're experiencing right now. This groundbreaking book is a crucial resource to anyone seeking to understand the people, places, and policies that have shaped and continue to shape life in the Keystone State and beyond." End quote. I'm excited to welcome Allen Dieterich-Ward to the podcast. Allen is a professor of history and director of the graduate school at Shippensburg University and the author of Cradle of Conservation. Allen, thanks so much for joining the program.
Christian, it's absolutely my pleasure. I'm a big fan of the show, and I'm super excited to get to talk to you about one of my very favorite topics in this world, and that is Pennsylvania's environmental history.
Tell us about Cradle of Conservation.
Sure. So Cradle of Conservation is the very first book that seeks to tackle this huge subject, and that is kind of all of Pennsylvania's environmental history across all of time. That could be an entire encyclopedia. Of course, there's already an encyclopedia just of Philadelphia, right? And so knowing that there were works out there already that dive into different specific topics dealing with Pennsylvania and dealing with the Pennsylvania environment, I wanted to create a book that was manageable, right? That gave a little taste for people of a whole lot of different things to try to create a unified whole, while also recognizing that there was no way that I could dig down into everything that people, that people wanted to hear about. And so Cradle of Conservation is a book that is manageable. It is a relatively easy read, as I joke around and say it's not Harry Potter. It is a serious book, but it does have lots of pictures, which is nice. And it's a fun book to read, I think, for folks to get you thinking about places that you may love, that you may enjoy, to get you thinking a little bit deeper about, what created that landscape that you may treasure.
And for me, as a newly formed nature nerd, I absolutely ran through this book. For me to read this in a couple days is like some people reading it in an hour. Right off the bat, I absolutely love the book. I would highly recommend it to everybody, anyone who's interested in conservation, Pennsylvania, nature, outdoors, things like that. I think they're great for.
Well, I'm grateful, and you're just the kind of reader that I'm really aiming this book for. Someone who is just interested and kind of wants to find out a bit more. And in many ways, this book will make you a little mini expert, on the Pennsylvania environment. because it does give that kind of big picture snapshot, right? That you can then go on your own and explore deeper in particular areas that you may not even have known kind of existed before. This can give you a little bit of a taste that you can then go off on your own and explore further.
Would you say that's what inspired you to write the book? Just the fact of being able to expose a new audience to this very important topic?
Yeah, there are a couple of different reasons I wrote the book, and I think we'll get into them more as we go through the podcast. But just starting with what you just said, you're a newfound nature nerd. I moved to Pennsylvania about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago now, and I was absolutely struck by just the gem of state forest and state park system that we have here in Pennsylvania. I come from Ohio. I jokingly say I come from the West Virginia part of Ohio, not the Indiana part of Ohio. So the landscape isn't all that different where I came from than here in Pennsylvania. But the efforts that the state of Pennsylvania has done over the last 150 years to conserve and to make available to the public such an enormous swath of land, that really struck me, kind of as soon as I arrived. I kind of put it, here's the way I put it. I work here at Shippensburg University, right in the middle of the Great Valley of the Appalachian Mountains, the Cumberland Valley. And I can look out one side of the building that I work in and see South Mountain, see where the Appalachian Trail is, see the Michaud State Forest. And I can just go and look out a window on the other side of that building, and I can see Blue Mountain and the Tuscarora State Forest, and just from that kind of view, tens and tens of thousands of acres that are yours, that are mine, that are the legacy of our ancestors, our acquired ancestors or our actual ancestors. And in its origins, that really kind of inspired me to get involved in thinking about Pennsylvania's environment, and ultimately to write this book, just wanting to get a sense of how did we get to the world that we live in today here in Pennsylvania.
Conservation, even just in Pennsylvania, is a big topic. But in order to address this from the beginning, it's important that we talk about the indigenous people that really were involved in the early practices. For generations, Pennsylvania's indigenous people care for the land. What were some of the ways they implemented conservation practices, and then how did these practices benefit them and the environment?
Sure. When the first Europeans arrived, when they kind of took in the coasts of North America, they kind of frequently referred to the park-like environment, as if maintained by the hand of God. Well, we know it wasn't by the hand of God, right? It was by the native peoples that had lived here for generations and generations before. Controlled burns, use of the ash from those burns, both to as fertilizer. The biggest change, of course, in Pennsylvania's indigenous history happened really a few hundred years, kind of slowly over the course of a few hundred years before the arrival of Europeans. And that was the adoption of agriculture, which slowly made its way to the east, to the north and the east of North America from its origins in what is now modern-day Central America and Mexico. We think of, I was actually just having this conversation with a good friend of mine who has taken up gardening. You talked about being a newfound nature nerd. Well, she's a newfound gardening nerd. And she was talking about, I think she called it forest gardening, a term I hadn't heard before. But basically she said, well, you don't grow things in rows. You kind of look at the ways in which plants can be compatible with each other and kind of supportive of each other. Well, that's the way that native peoples did it. We refer to that as kind of the three sisters of corns, beans, and squash. A less labor-intensive mechanism for growing foods that nutritionally are complementary for human nutrition, but also are complementary to each other. The beans growing up the corn stalk, the corn providing that stock, the beans replacing nitrogen as a legume in the soil, and then the squash spreading out at the base to keep the weeds down. So a better system for low labor agriculture you won't find in the world.
And I feel like those efforts weren't really fully recognized as something that indigenous people have been doing for generations until much later, where it was like, oh, what happens if we just bulldoze everything and then force our will on nature?
Well, yes and no. I think that the description that you just gave is something that developed a bit later in Pennsylvania history, kind of after and kind of coterminous with and after the scientific revolution and changes in agriculture. The first colonists very quickly actually adopted many of the practices of native peoples because they were in the same situation often that native peoples were, in that they were land rich but labor poor. After all, a lot of the advantages that European colonists had was that there are no large draft animals that are native to the Americas, kind of north of Colombia. And even there, we're talking about alpacas and llamas compared to oxen and to horses. And so colonists really, the labor that they had was by and large their own labor. And so they actually often adopted many of the practices of native peoples. And so the Three Sisters, many colonists grew the Three Sisters. Pumpkins are a great food source. Some ridiculous percentage of the pumpkins that we grow today are used only for jack-o'-lanterns and then discarded. Pumpkins are a fantastic food source, a nutritional source. And in fact, if you're looking for a good book to read, I'll hold it up for you and you can recommend it if you want. It's one of my favorite books. It's an academic book, but it's really great. It's a history of pumpkins in the Americas. It's a great book. You will never look at a pumpkin again once you read this. So I highly recommend that by Cindy Ott. It's called Pumpkin: The Curious History of an American Icon. It's great. Anyway, so the colonists actually did adopt many of the native people's practices. That did not necessarily mean that they got along well with native peoples over time, although in Pennsylvania, kind of famously, relationships with native peoples were better than they were in other colonies. In any event, indigenous people play a really important role in the origin of the book, and in fact, or in the development of the book. And in fact, one of the things that it was really important to me was to sort of track native peoples as much as I could across time. This book is in the Pennsylvania History series that's published by the Pennsylvania Historical Association and Temple University Press. I did not spend an enormous amount of time on native peoples because there's already a fantastic book in that series that is going to have an updated edition published soon on Native Americans in Pennsylvania by a really well-known Native American scholar named Dan Richter. So keep an eye out for that book. Much of the early parts of my book in talking about native peoples are drawn from Dan Richter.
From the beginning of colonization, William Penn was conservation-minded. Can you tell us about his quote-unquote green country town?
Yeah, I mean, Penn is... I think it's important to neither turn William Penn into a saint or into a demon, right?
Sure, yeah.
And so, it's, as with any human being, he has different motivations, right? He was not an environmentalist in the modern sense. There was no notion of a quote unquote environment in the way that we understand it today. But he did, I think, share similarities with the conservationist movement that would emerge in the late 19th century, in that he was interested in ensuring that his new utopian community would be sustainable over the long term, right? He had to make money. He was deeply in debt. And so finances were really important to him. But he also saw himself as creating a community that would stand the test of time. And so he did a couple of things that we sort of look back to as a model for what later conservationism would be. I should say that at the time, many of the things that he suggested doing were promptly ignored by colonists, particularly after his death. And sort of the taking over of his inheritance by his second wife and his sons. Now, two things. We have to remember William Penn was coming out of a London that had absolutely cataclysmic disasters in his youth. The plague, of course, one of the times the plague came through was when he was young, and that was quickly followed by the Great Fire of London, and much that destroyed much of the original medieval city. So Penn's vision, in some ways, I think foreshadowing later suburbanization that we'll see in places like Levittown, was relatively large lots, houses on relatively large lots. He had a vision that people would garden in their, kind of in their in their backyards. And this was in part to kind of separate folks enough so that if there was a fire, it wouldn't jump from building to building to building. He also sort of famously spoke about setting aside an acre of woods for every set number of acres that would be used. And that, of course, is because he recognized that Pennsylvania was going to need a lot of wood, both for building, but then also wood was the primary, fuel for home fires, for industry. And so you couldn't have a sustainable community if kind of all of the wood was just kind of, taken up, patch after patch after patch. He also kind of finally encouraged his colonists to keep an eye out for productive trees and plants, right? To set those aside, to cherish those. Again, he had that eye toward the marketplace, but also that eye toward not just immediate gains, but also in sort of the greatest good for the longest time, as Gifford Pinchot would much later describe it.
That all sounds like good ideas.
They are good ideas. What ended up happening was people looked for the wood that was the easiest to find. The public squares that he set up squares in every quadrant in Philadelphia as designed as commons, as public commons. They quickly became trash dumps and waste disposal sites, and people picked through them for, kind of for many generations. They were just spoiled. And his vision of peaceful coexistence with Native peoples ended up in the particularly violent 7 Years' War. But hey, you do what you can with what you got, right?
Hard to fight human nature, yeah.
I suppose.
How did Benjamin Franklin earn the moniker of America's first environmentalist?
I think Franklin is another good example of what we might think of as enlightened self-interest, right? and quite literally, in Franklin's case, quite literally enlightenment self-interest. Franklin, of course, was this self-made man who made his fortune with his wits and his brains, and by running away from a required indentured that he initially had, and really dedicated his life later on to scientific pursuits, and then eventually political pursuits, as we know. Franklin's sort of folk referring to Franklin as the first environmentalist. Of course, part of that comes from the scientific work he did in looking at nature. He was very interested in improving agriculture and exploration. He famously appealed to the British king to have John Bartram, this kind of gentleman farmer in Philadelphia, to be named the royal botanist, and spent a lot of his time with other Philadelphians of his same class, looking to make agricultural improvements. but the big thing that he did had to do with water and water quality. So kind of the very center of Philadelphia early on was Dock Creek. And near Dock Creek, Franklin had his print shop and his home. And by the time it got to the 1730s, the area around Dock Creek was becoming increasingly, frankly, uninhabitable because industry was growing along Duck Creek as well, and particularly those industries that needed water as an easy way to dispose of kind of noxious chemicals and liquids. In this case, tanneries, tanning hides. Franklin and his neighbors in the late 1730s, had sort of unsuccessfully petitioned to have these tanneries removed from Dock Creek. That didn't work. Later on in the 1760s, Franklin ended up sort of leading a couple of commissions focused on water quality and how Philadelphia was going to get clean water to drink. If you ever go to Franklin's print shop in Philadelphia, take a look, go into the back of the shop and you'll see two kind of stones or concrete tablets on the ground. One of them says Franklin's Well, and one of them says Privy, and they are uncomfortably close to each other. Let's just put it that way, right? So the real thing, though, that cements Franklin's legacy as an environmentalist in the 1790s, just as he's reaching the end of his life, he actually adds a codicil to his will that sets aside a portion of his estate to fund improvements to the Philadelphia water supply, which sort of end up becoming one of the bases for Philadelphia's public water system a decade or so later.
One of the things I enjoyed the most about the book was learning about new conservation heroes, these people that don't get the publicity, don't have the big names that, we're used to. Who are some of the unsung conservation heroes that you want to highlight?
Sure. Well, the book begins with one of them, Ralph Brock, who has now at least come to some attention. He was a protege of Joseph Rothrock, who's on the cover of the book. Rothrock is kind of depicted as the father of Pennsylvania forestry and conservation. He was a botanist and medical doctor at the University of Pennsylvania. Rothrock was from the town. Brock was from the town Rothrock lived in Westchester, and he really came to Rothrock's attention as kind of as a smart guy. Rothrock took him under his wing and encouraged him to study at Penn. And then when the first forestry school in Pennsylvania, which was really the second forestry school that survived in the United States right after the Yale Forestry School, Ralph Brock became one of the first class that went to the forestry school. Brock became one of the first class. He was the first professionally trained forester in the world, the first African-American forester in the world. And his is a real story, I think, that underscores the presence of people of color at the kind of the origins of conservation. As I talk about in the book, his story is also a tragic one. He, despite his aptitude, despite his success, the color of his skin defines his ability to succeed or not succeed within forestry in Pennsylvania. He eventually leaves. There were a couple of reasons for why he left, but it was very clear that no matter what his skills were, white men were not going to listen to him. And so he ends up leaving, and you can read more about him in the book. But he's a great story for kind of for the origins of forestry and placing people of color there. And that leads me, I think, in addition to individuals, one of the goals of the book, I think, is to recast some of the broader stories about Pennsylvania with through an environmental lens. So, for example, if we're thinking about the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement is ultimately a big part of it is about access to environmental amenities, whether those are swimming pools, whether those are public spaces, whether those are clean, healthy neighborhoods. Kind of that story of environmental inequalities really goes part and parcel with the broader civil rights story in Pennsylvania. And you can really follow that through its entire existence, kind of all the way up through kind of one of the more famous sort of recent examples. And that is in the kind of the first really successful environmental rights lawsuit in the country in Chester. And you can look at Zuline Mayfield and Horace Strand as sort of that trajectory of civil rights and environmental rights all the way through. Similarly, if you're really looking for unsung conservation heroes, right alongside Ralph Brock is Mira Lloyd Dock, who was the first woman to hold any state office in the state of Pennsylvania, appointed or elected. She was appointed to the State Forestry Commission shortly after its founding by Rothrock. And that made her the first woman appointed to a forestry commission in the world, right? She had a hand in basically all of the different elements of early conservation of forestry in Pennsylvania. She also was really the prime driver, along with some others, including Horace McFarland, of sort of cleaning up and remaking Harrisburg. And I think Doc's story of this kind of frankly middle-aged woman who had raised her family. Her mother died when she was young. She took care of her father, raised her family, and kind of in middle age, in her 40s, she just discovered this passion for botany, which then took her, into forestry. But then also, if you live in Harrisburg, we owe a great debt to Mira Lloyd Dock. She launched the campaign to clean up the Susquehanna Riverbank, to create a lot of the amenities that we really see as kind of defining life in Harrisburg today. So,
reading the Ralph Brock story, you're like, oh, I hope it turns out good for him. Like you're reading it because you're like, oh, he's the first black forester in the world, and he's getting this education, and he's he starts doing the nursery work, and then you're like, oh, it just keeps going, right? He just has a great life after that. He's one of the most known foresters in the world. It just doesn't happen that way.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, he does have. I mean, his story shifts to a different one. He ends up actually having a very successful career as a nurseryman. That's really what he's most interested in. But it takes him not to the forests of Pennsylvania, but actually to the urban streets of New York City. When he's done, he ends up working one of the initial landscapers at Radio City Music Hall and Rockefeller Center. And then sort of takes that career in that trajectory.
How would you explain the concept of working in landscapes in Pennsylvania and how that impacted conservation practices?
This is, I think, when we talk about this book as being something to draw everyday people in to thinking about Pennsylvania, to thinking about Pennsylvania's environment, the concept of a working landscape that's really my way of pulling you in. So close your eyes, right? And just imagine in your mind when I say a Pennsylvania landscape, right? Just picture that in your mind, right? And you may be thinking of your favorite trail in the state forest. You may be thinking of the drive along the Pennsylvania Turnpike as you're driving in between Carlisle and Bedford. You may be thinking about one of your favorite state parks, whitewater rafting in Ohiopyle, or in Cherry Springs, right? One of our one of the darkest places in the Northeast. the concept of a working landscape really pushes you to think about the ways in which that vision that you have is not static, right? That it has taken hundreds or even thousands of years to kind of get to looking like what it looks like to you. And the goal is to really uncover the various ways in which that space, that static, in one place, the way it has changed over time, and the ways in which people have interacted with that space, the way in which the landscape has shaped Pennsylvanians, and the ways in which the Pennsylvanians have shaped that landscape, right? Oftentimes in ways that are kind of absolutely central to our identity, right? Central to the way we think about ourselves. And that's this other part of this, that it's not just about kind of the physical work of that landscape, working that landscape, existing on that landscape, but also the mental ways in which the stories we tell ourselves, that, the politics, the alliances that we have, the relationships that we build. So many of them are about interpreting those landscapes in particular ways, right? And so you can imagine that a state forest looks very different, right, to a forester, right, or to a lumberman than it does to someone who works an office job and goes and hikes the Appalachian Trail on the weekends, right? Sort of the ways in which you interpret and imagine that landscape change based upon your perspective. The work that it does, the cultural, the intellectual work that it does is really comes to define what it means to be a Pennsylvanian. And so that sort of idea of thinking about a particular place, how it changes over time, and how it changes based on who is thinking about it, who is looking about it, that's one of the ways that I really try to draw folks into the book.
Does that also relate to kind of Gifford Pinchot's idea of like, this is not just about beautiful nature, it's also about resources and how we can manage those resources, which can be uncomfortable for people who are outdoorsy?
That's right. And I think that you've hit at sort of one of the ways in which our understanding of landscapes has changed over time. And of course, that isn't just about over time, it's also about today, right? And I think I think about farmers. I grew up on a beef farm, and the ways in which a farmer thinks about the land, right,
Yeah.
is very different than someone who is consuming that land aesthetically, right, or out a car window, right. And for Pinchot, right, the kind of this father of conservation more broadly, and his contemporaries, they were really looking at conservation from a producer's point of view, right? They were at a moment in time where, Pinchot's family had made enormous wealth off of extractive industries, right? Off of primarily for Pinchot of lumbering. And they had made tremendous wealth. Pinchot was living at a moment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when America was really coming to dominate economically the world stage. Of course, after the two world wars, it would, all of its economic competitors would lie in shambles, right? But at this moment, there was this concern that the natural resources and the use of natural resources that had driven kind of America to greatness, there was concern about the ability to sustain that over more generations, right? And so from a producer's point of view, right, what we call a utilitarian point of view, Pinchot and his contemporaries, they agreed with the notion that we should primarily look at the natural world as something to be harnessed for human benefit. But the additional element that they added was to think about future generations and the ways in which that those resources could be used not just to extract wealth from today, but to think about how that could be in place for generations to come. Now, that's a different mindset than we're going to see a bit later on with the environmental movement. And without getting too academic about it, right? One of the ways in which we can see the environmental movement is of criticizing the conservation movement, in part because of its short-sightedness, right? And of its kind of only looking to human beings and seeing the natural world that kind of something that could be kind of fundamentally controlled, right? And this comes, without oversimplifying, with a consumerist framework that is of not just how can we maximize production from the natural world, but how can we maintain the ecological foundation for the natural world? Seeing trees not just as an agricultural product, but also as something that was involved in these broader ecological networks. But also looking to recreational value, aesthetic value, and I think very importantly, public health value. So we see that kind of that different point of view coming out of this environmental movement in a generation or two after the conservation movement.
Pennsylvania's landscapes were forever changed following the massive timbering operations of the late 18 and early 1900s. What ideas, practices, and leaders came out as a result to protect our over-destruction of our natural lands?
Sure. This is an interesting one. Now, we've already talked about some of these folks like Pinchot and Mira, Lloyd, and Joseph Rothrock. One of the things that I think is interesting that folks, that folks don't necessarily think about is when we're talking about harvesting trees, for example. It really is this moment in the late 19th century where we have a kind of a different kind of production that happens. And that's what we really associate kind of with northern Pennsylvania and particularly northwestern Pennsylvania, where you have this kind of clear cutting of woods that that had been inaccessible a generation before. This kind of industrial harvesting of large portions of woodlands. I want to contrast that with one of the models. Ironically, I think one of the models that we see for the conservation movement, and that are these kind of older uses of woods that we have here in central Pennsylvania for the charcoal industry, right? And so when we think about charcoal, these were these big plantations, right? That spread over thousands of acres, where you would need to have trees to basically to slow burn them, to cook them, to become charcoal, to make iron. Well, the trick with those areas were that you couldn't just clear cut all of the trees out because then your charcoal business would be done, right? And so some of the earliest state forests are actually like Pine Grove Furnace, right? Like Mont Alto, like Caledonia. These are actually coming out of these older wood plantations that had been essentially managed for generations and still kind of had trees on them. And this then becomes this model for conservation. And many of the folks who were these conservationists were trained engineers, right? They were trained mining engineers, for example, that bought into this concept of needing to maintain things for multiple generations. And they actually looked to the clear cutting that was happening in other parts of the state. Kind of, they were aghast, right, at the rapid ways in which these forests were being decimated.
And I'm sure you've obviously seen the photos of what the landscape looked like. I've checked out the state archive photos. They're just so terrible. The thing that makes me feel good is the fact that they felt something when they saw those photos during the time. Like the fact that they saw that and they're like, we got to figure something out. Like, this is not the way.
The biggest issue was without spoiling too much of the book, so you can read it. But the biggest issue really was, I think, changes in demand. As the Great Plains were being settled and harvested, with these kind of new agricultural lands that didn't have a lot of lumber for home building, a lot of those Pennsylvania trees ended up being used for frame homes in places like Kansas and Nebraska and even Minnesota. But the other big change was in technology. The introduction of railroads that allowed access to new places, along with demand for timbers for train tracks and for burning for steam locomotives. As well as mechanical cutting tools, chainsaws, mechanical cutting tools, and log lifters. So the use of steam technology both sort of created a demand for more and more wood products, as well as as well as the ability to access places that had formerly been, really economically inaccessible for harvesting.
A new focus on conservation came out of the City Beautiful movement. Can you tell us about this movement?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's one thing that that folks may not be expecting when they read my book. There's a lot of city folk in this book, right? This is not, this is not simply a book about forestry. It really is about all of Pennsylvania's landscapes. And one of the things that I really wanted to underscore were the ways in which rural and urban and suburban landscapes, they have a lot in common in terms of the ways in which the rural conservation movement, the forestry movement, really came out of the same set of ideas in large part that the urban city beautiful movement did. And of course, Mira Lloyd Dock, in the person of Mira Lloyd Dock, we can see someone who was kind of really instrumental in both of those movements in Pennsylvania. I mean, this notion of improving public health, of economic conservation, those ideas permeated this kind of big P progressive movement in the late 19th century, and created a whole set of ideologies that translated into public policy that affected urban neighborhoods as well as rural areas. So I think the other piece that's important to this is that when we're thinking about the conservation movement, in order to have public policy change, that takes people with power to be able to impose. And, those people with power were urbanites, in the late 19th century. Now, we do see a coalition of people, kind of small town urban folks. We see this coalition that emerges. But, the Pennsylvania Forestry Association, which really drove public policy changes, that does not develop out of the needs of rural lumbermen, right? That develops out of the worldview of wealthy urban people who can essentially afford to say, we're going to set aside big chunks of rural land to conserve for other generations. And you can see this, I think, this tension when you start looking at kind of the winners and losers of the conservation movement in the short term, right? In the long term, you can make the argument that kind of all of Pennsylvania benefits. But in the short term, poor rural people who are used to being able to gather firewood, who are used to being able to to shoot animals or to trap animals for fur. Suddenly, those kind of local practices, again, we kind of talk about the state forest system as if it's some kind of unified whole. In reality, we are talking about people's backyards, right? We're talking about the woods down the street that that we've always used. I mean, these are local places, even if they're seen kind of as part of this bigger statewide system. And so suddenly, practices that had been celebrated, right, as the pioneer spirit, right, the backwoodsman, the self-sufficiency that kind of America was founded on, suddenly these things are illegal. Right, grazing your cattle, right, becomes illegal. You have to get a permit for that. Gathering firewood becomes a timber theft. Shooting a deer or shooting or trapping a fox becomes poaching, right? And so there are losers to this in the local communities, particularly poor people, right, who are depending on these things for their livelihoods, for their sustenance. We see the ways this also plays out in terms of class and in terms of ethnicity. Pennsylvania had a law on the books that prevented immigrants from owning guns and from getting a hunting permit, right? And this was because of this kind of perceived notion of immigrants as being as not being fair game hunters, right? I mean, hunting was for sport, not for sustenance. Fishing was for sport, not for sustenance, right? And so there are these class and ethnic biases that come to define the ways in which Pennsylvanians interact with the landscape. And so, as with all public policies, there are winners and losers.
And now, let's hear from our sponsors. Looking for a way to celebrate International Women's Day while making a difference? Join the Keystone Trails Association, Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, and trail enthusiasts Tori Talks Trails and Hikes and Hops blog on March 8th for Red Up Tom's Run. This special trail care event focuses on vital trail maintenance and invasive species removal in Pittsburgh. Lend a hand and enjoy the great outdoors. Visit kta-hike.org to register and to learn more. Are you looking for your next adventure? Unlock some of the best landscapes in Pennsylvania with incredibly detailed, highly curated, waterproof trail maps from the folks at Purple Lizard. They create extraordinary maps of Pennsylvania State Forest for people who love to explore the outdoors. Find them at your local outfitters, bike shops, and bookstores, or visit purplelizard.com, where your next adventure begins. Walk, run, or roll to save the trees. Join the Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation for the Bob Ross Run for the Trees Happy Little 5K. Proceeds from registration go towards planting trees in Pennsylvania state parks and forests. This virtual 5K can be done anywhere, anytime, April 19th to 27th, 2025. And participants get cool swag. Learn more or sign up at ppff.events/runforthetrees. Looking for a way to add some local Pennsylvania flair to your space? Check out Sister Sunflowers. They create unique stickers inspired by small local spaces that make your community shine. From quirky caves to hidden local gems, their stickers bring your favorite places to life. Perfect for your laptop, water bottle, or anywhere that needs a little hometown love. For both locals and visitors, there's stickers, magnets, prints, and more celebrating Pennsylvania's most iconic parks and forests. And for more avid explorers, there's even a hand-drawn poster to keep track of Pennsylvania state parks and forests that you've been to. Use the code HELLBENDER15 at checkout to get 15% off your first order. Support local, inspire adventure, and decorate with meaning. Only at Sister Sunflowers. Shop now and celebrate the places that make your town special. All right, back to the show. I think you do a really good job of that in the book, that every time that you're talking about conservation, you're like, whoa, don't forget, there's winners and there's losers. Like, yes, this land is now set aside and people can go and take their hikes, but now this person who's been hunting there for 25 years can't do that anymore. They can't go get firewood. They can't, unless they're breaking the law. That was really interesting. That's not just one kind of people that are always impacted. It seems like lots of different people.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Usually the lower socioeconomic scale are the ones that usually get hit the hardest by a good thing, which is still conservation.
That's right. And that's why I very consciously, you used the term hero earlier. And I think that there's a fine line, I think, to me. Well, I should say, as an academic historian, I have to be careful not to allow my personal enjoyment of something in the contemporary day to influence the way I look at the past, right? And as a person, as someone who celebrates and loves these landscapes, I want to look to their originators as heroes, right? But it's dangerous to do that, And I'll give you an example why that is. You asked earlier sort of what my motivations were for writing the book. I gave you some of my personal motivations, but more professionally, I'm part of a broader sort of collective called the Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Project. And I've been involved with this group for more than a decade now, that's really seeking to kind of, in your words, to kind of, uncover, to celebrate, to bring to prominence these conservation heroes. And the Conservation Heritage Project kind of started out with that mission, looking to people like Rothrock, looking to people like Gifford Pinchot. Later on, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, looking to people like Maurice Goddard, who became this kind of long-term. If Rothrock was the father of state forests, Goddard was the father of state parks. And kind of the first phase of the Conservation Heritage Project was really kind of looking to these conservation heroes. The second phase of the Conservation Heritage Project was to look past some of those folks and to look at this kind of these other heroes who were not as well known, folks like Mira Lloyd Dock, folks like Ralph Brock. And kind of in that process, we've come to celebrate, folks like Brock. Brock has a historical marker at what's now Penn State Mont Alto. Mira Lloyd Dock, the state nursery, was renamed for Mira Lloyd Dock as the Mira Lloyd Dock Conservation and Resource Center. The third phase of the project, though, that we're working on kind of right now, that's emerging, and that our Department of Conservation and Natural Resources is really leaning into as well, is to look at untold stories. And oftentimes, these untold stories are more complicated than the hero narratives. And they underscore, I think, the ways in which class and race and gender have affected who has access to clean, healthy environments, to environmental amenities, in a way that I kind of talk about extensively in the book. And one of the things that the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources has been really focused on is to kind of understand, why is there often an undercurrent of skepticism when looking at state agencies like DCNR, particularly among people of color and indigenous people, African American people, and in part that's because the greater good of the larger number, in Gifford Pinchot's sort of the greatest good for the largest number of the longest time. Well, the benefits to the majority sometimes come at the cost to the minority. And it's really hard to ask somebody to celebrate when they're the ones who are paying the price or have been disproportionately asked to pay that price. One example of that is in the creation of state parks and state forests, where you see the use of eminent domain to take lands. And that's a complicated story, but if you look outside of Johnstown, for example, there was an African-American community that was, the eminent domain was taken and incorporated into a state park. And that's kind of one of the untold stories that DCNR is working on. The Kinzu Dam in northwestern Pennsylvania. That dam has performed its role. It protects cities like Pittsburgh and other downstream cities from flooding. And it's a lovely place for boating on and enjoying and taking your family. But it came at the expense of basically the one Native American reservation that we had in the state of Pennsylvania that was granted to corn planters people by George Washington at the founding of the nation, right? And so this kind of latest stage of the Pennsylvania Conservation Heritage Project is really digging into and trying to figure out, how do we go about balancing the need to really celebrate public policy, celebrate this legacy of environmental protection, but to do so in a way that also acknowledges the injustices, right, of that. And of course, that then helps to tell a narrative that helps to contextualize environmental injustice in the world today, right? And that's a tricky balance, but it's one that I've been very pleased the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources has really shown a willingness to do that in recent years. And I think in part it is about, you can't build coalitions. You can't build effective public policies if you are going to ignore things that you don't want to see. And I think that is a kind of, I have really tried to structure this book in a way by looking at civil rights, by looking at the winners and losers of environmental history. I can tell a story that doesn't just start in the 1980s, or doesn't just start with Chester, but actually kind of frames this in terms of a much longer trajectory of balancing and acknowledging the sacrifices to some folks that are made for a better environment for all of us.
And I think as an academic, that's what we expect you to do.
Sure.
When you write this sort of book, and it were to be just like MK Goddard never did anything wrong.
Sure.
And you could have this idea of just like, oh well, this is what we've always been taught, so this is what it is. But then when you read scholarly important work, and even if it's luckily this is much more entertaining than just a regular paper, but when you read your book, you can feel the focus that was put on, like, hey, a lot of good was done, some bad was done. I'll leave it up to you to see the good and the bad and what was done. And I think that's important. I think it's what one of the things I enjoyed so much about your book, because it doesn't just tell one side and like everyone was great and everything turned out awesome. Nobody lost. It's like you got to highlight those people. You have to highlight the communities that lost something.
And I think it's important to do that because we face a lot of difficult choices in the world today. And if we pretend as if everyone just came to a decision in the past that was universally supported, that makes it feel like we're doing something wrong in the contentious debates that we have today, right? Or, and I think, again, when we talk about environmental inequalities, right, or we talk about social, environmental justice, we can that needs to be contextualized, and it needs to be explained as part of a bigger phenomena of trade-offs that have always existed, in Pennsylvania's environmental history, and by understanding how and why decisions were made in the past, that can, I think, help us. Hard decisions are always hard. That's why they're called hard decisions, right? Yeah. But it can also help us to understand and potentially chart better paths forward that acknowledge and can take into account the ways in which historical injustices are going to frame the way that people view the world, right? And we can certainly see that in our contemporary politics, right? I mean, if you don't understand the collapse of the steel industry and the ways in which our improved environment goes hand in hand with a decline in economic opportunities, or at least a perceived decline in economic opportunities for a whole class of people in a whole big swath of the state of Pennsylvania, it makes it easier to understand and have empathy for people, even if you ultimately disagree with the solutions that they might propose or with the public policies that they might have. And again, I mentioned to you, without belaboring this any farther, I mentioned to you that I grew up on a beef farm. Well, my dad was a coal miner. He worked 35 years in a coal mine. When you grow up the son of a coal miner, the environmental movement takes on a little bit of a different flavor, and you understand, I think, the trade-offs between environmental improvement and economic opportunity, that it can sometimes be easy to brush aside if you are not coming from that perspective.
As we've spoken about a little bit, women have played an incredibly important role in Pennsylvania's conservation movement. Can you tell us about the kind of work that they did, the variety of what they did?
Yes. One of the things when you asked me about some of our unsung heroes, I would point to, as a group, women as being key to this. So in the late 19th century, women like Mira Lloyd who couldn't vote, right, and who couldn't participate directly in political life. This was a moment of kind of historical importance for women who joined clubs and developed ideas and implemented those ideas in a way that had never been seen before. The civic club movement, the women's club movement, the garden club movement. When we talk about City Beautiful and this kind of first wave of urban revitalization, and when we talk about the forestry movement, these are movements that could not have happened without the women that drove them. In community after community after community, small towns like Carlisle, big cities like Philadelphia, middle-class women poured their energies, right, their time into community improvement projects, into playgrounds, into clean streets, eventually into clean water, into sanitation systems. This was this whole movement that folks like Doc called municipal housekeeping, right? Women leaned into their role as homemakers, but applied that outside of the home to the community as a whole. That became the ability to get this work done was, again, almost entirely due to women's activities. The environmental movement of the 60s and 70s, particularly of the 60s and 70s, also relied extensively on women, particularly women who were focused on public health, on their children's health, on cleaning up and providing opportunities, for their families, for their children. Women, they are often not the ones that are on the letterhead, but they are actually the ones who are getting the work done.
Following World War II, and thanks to the work of Rachel Carson, new attention was placed on preserving our environment. Can you tell us about the environmental revolution that was taking place in the Pennsylvania General Assembly?
Yeah, and I think that this is something that folks don't fully understand or haven't fully acknowledged. Between 1967 and about 1972 or so, Pennsylvania completely developed an entirely complete new set of rules and a worldview to go along with it, based around this notion of an integrated environment, right? Prior to this time, laws dealing with conservation, laws dealing with water pollution, these were kind of filed under traditional notions of nuisances, right? And they were seen as kind of separate bodies, separate things entirely. That's why we have a game commission and a fish and boat commission, right? These things were kind of separate. It was in this environmental revolution of the late 60s and 70s where the notion of an environment, this kind of integrated whole, this ecological web, flowing out of ideas that Carson didn't develop, but popularized, came to have a moment of kind of, I think, unique and unparalleled public support, right? And we tend to focus on this effort on the national level, and I can appreciate that, why we do that. That histories are often written on the national level, but Pennsylvania drives that. Pennsylvania, in our federal system, it's really the states that are driving things. And in Pennsylvania, we do a couple of different things. We pass a series, there's this kind of class of legislators that are elected in 67 and 68. The Democrats take control of the legislature, but by and large, there are a number of different sort of environmental pollution problems nationally, but then also in Pennsylvania that sort of undercut the argument that industries can sort of manage themselves. In addition to that, particularly the bituminous coal industry is still thriving, but it's nowhere near at the peak that it was. Technological improvements have made it so that there are fewer miners doing work. This happens the same in the anthracite region too. And so the political power of the mining industry, which had limited, clean water laws, it kind of weakens. And so you have this whole series of laws that are passed, kind of during this time period that rewrite environmental regulations, create environmental regulations in Pennsylvania. And this is capped off by kind of two things. One is a philosophical thing, and one is a practical thing. The practical thing is that a bunch of different elements of state agencies, the Department of Mines and Minerals, the Department of Forests and Waters, public pollution control things in the Department of Health, the Sanitary Water Board, all of these kind of different individual agencies, with the notable exception of the Fish and Boat Commission and the Game Commission, all get integrated into this massive Department of Environmental Resources with Maurice Goddard, this kind of father of Pennsylvania state parks, at the head. So that's kind of the practical thing. All of these different individual things get packaged together in one agency, and Pennsylvanians pass an environmental rights amendment that enshrines the right of Pennsylvanians to a whole host of things. And there are surprising ones that are actually included in that you should read for yourself, but enshrine the right of Pennsylvanians to a clean and healthy environment. That I say philosophical because it doesn't really affect law directly until about 40 years later, when it is implemented more effectively in the Marcellus Shale era of Pennsylvania history. But needless to say, there's this whole new body of law that is created that kind of creates a regulatory framework for improving Pennsylvania's environment. And all of these national laws, these changes on the national level, really get filtered through this regulation in Pennsylvania developed during this period. It truly is a revolution, and one in which I should say we're dealing with the consequences still of today. There are winners and losers to this environmental revolution, and some of those winners and losers, it takes a long time to kind of understand fully what the ramifications of this are, and we're dealing with them today still, for better or worse.
And it's interesting to see too, kind of how the theme of what we've been talking about, of like a diverse coalition of people that would support this. It's not like the amendment to the Constitution was, barely squeaked by.
It was huge. And it was unanimously, any Pennsylvania legislation has to be passed by two consecutive general assemblies, both houses. It was passed unanimously both times. And then it passed by a 4-1 margin in a public referendum.
I don't know if that's happened since.
It has not. Yeah, I mean, that is, I don't think, I shouldn't say that. I don't think that it has happened since. I mean, it was unparalleled popularity. Now, the enthusiasm for it gets complicated really fast. It gets complicated really fast, right? Because there's a whole host of reasons why it gets complicated. But a big part of it is deindustrialization, right? And this is passed at this kind of peak moment of American economic power and Pennsylvania economic power. We associate the 70s and the sort of the post-Vietnam era with declining faith in government, declining faith in big institutions, declining faith in science. And also massive economic changes that in part are blamed on environmental regulation. And there becomes this narrative that that clean water and clean air, that there's this inherent trade-off between those things and the economy. And in 1970, there's this vision that all of that stuff can happen, and there's plenty of money to go around, and things can get cleaned up if we just kind of make these polluters pay. But there are winners and losers to this, right? And fairly or unfairly, one of the ways, and fairly or unfairly, environmental regulation get blamed in part for deindustrialization. You can make an argument that that's unfair, no doubt about it. But when two things happen at about the same time, it's folks can draw a causation if there is only just correlation there.
You spent time in the book focusing on the influence people have had on environmental issues in the General Assembly. It wasn't just the things that we've talked about. Pennsylvanians have had an influence on what have passed for environmental legislation. There's certainly been successes. What are some of the other successes you think that were important to note during that time period?
Ralph Abel taking over at Fish and Boat, I think, is one significant change and success. The Fish Commission was really established primarily focused on game fish, and their primary emphasis was not on preventing water pollution by and large, but on there were some environmental improvements, but this commission is really funded by fishing licenses, and so if your primary revenue is from fishing licenses, then you want to make sure that you're providing the kinds of fish that fishermen want to have. In the 1970s, Ralph Abel, who was one of the key players in the environmental revolution, is appointed head of the Fish Commission. And he takes on what he calls a resource-first philosophy. That is to say, focus on the resource, not on the consumer, and expands, with the support of the General Assembly, expands the mission of the Fish Commission to also focus on amphibians and reptiles. We forget about that, but the Fish Commission is responsible not just for fish, but also for conservation of amphibians and reptiles. Similarly, the Game Commission, which again is funded by hunting licenses, right? For those of us who enjoy hiking and exploring game lands and kind of see them the same as state forests or state parks, the reality is that their primary source of revenue is from hunting licenses, and which I'm not a hunter, and so I thank my hunting friends for supporting these great lands that we have. But in any event, the Game Commission shifts its focus from to a conservation and even an environmental model. Up until this time, there were bounties. There were still bounties on animals seen as nuisance animals. On bears, on bobcats, on birds. The Game Commission really shifts its focus to one focus just kind of extensively on making sure there are enough white-tailed deer to be able to hunt during hunting season, to looking at a broader ecological focus on an environmentalist focus really of thinking not just like a producer, but about what all ecologically needs to happen to have healthy lands, to have healthy landscapes. And so this environmental revolution, again, as much as it gets kind of focused on the environmental regulatory state and on cleaning up pollution, it has this much broader impact on on perceptions and on state agencies. In addition to that, you have the development of new nonprofit organizations that are dedicated to land conservation, to pollution prevention, and to kind of pushing the agencies to enforce environmental law. During the course of the 70s, while the pace of environmental regulation slows, you do have important bills that are passed in the state legislature, floodplain, development in floodplains. Some of the most important things that are developed coming out of the Federal Clean Water Act, but also, again, the predating state Clean Streams Act and Clean Water Act, is the development of municipal sewage and sewage infrastructure, right? And so the kind of benefits of these investments in infrastructure, they really come into play in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I think transform the way in which people understand and interact with the natural world and the expectations that they have. bald eagles were functionally extinct in Pennsylvania, and now it is common to see bald eagles, right? Foxes and bobcats and bears, right? All of these things come out of really the legacy of this environmental revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. People swim in the rivers in Pittsburgh now, right? Kayaking, boating, kind of the transformation of communities like Pittsburgh, like Harrisburg, like Philadelphia into kind of river cities in which the quality of life in those communities is kind of determined by their access to water. That is all a legacy of this environmental revolution of the late 60s and early 70s.
How has Pennsylvanians' political will to fight for and ability to influence these issues changed over time?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it's one that is still, I think, is still evolving. One of the things I do, again, as an academic in the book is to look at what makes Pennsylvania similar to and different from other states, nearby states. And I think the most useful state to compare us to is to New York. The landscape is the same, kind of the geographical size is approximately the same, the industrialization is the same, and so forth. Pennsylvania public policy at various times has followed on and then I think expanded upon New York's. So the Adirondacks and the Catskills were kind of the first big conserved areas in the certainly in the eastern United States that I think influenced and set the stage for Pennsylvania's state forest system. New York had a conservation amendment to its constitution that helped to spur the environmental amendment to Pennsylvania's constitution. But New York really, if you say if you walked up to someone and said, our New York, what's the difference between New York's politics and Pennsylvania's politics? I think you could probably identify some today, right? There's a different political landscape. And to my mind, that political landscape is kind of defined by the dominance in New York State of New York City and its kind of auxiliary communities, right? New York City is so big, and kind of the other communities, Albany, Syracuse, there's this connection between New York, through the old Erie Canal corridor that sort of aligns the interests of enough New Yorkers that they don't really have to listen to people in other parts of the state, right? You know what I'm saying? In a way that Pennsylvania doesn't have. Philadelphia loses to New York City as kind of the dominant city of the Americas, and as important as Philadelphia's politics are, or even take Philadelphia and Pittsburgh together, they don't have anything like the dominance that the New York City metropolitan area has in New York State. And so what that means is that people with different perspectives and uses of the landscape, right? In order to get public policy to happen in Pennsylvania, you have to have coalition building and a finding of a convergence of interests among very different groups of people that you simply don't have to have in New York State, because one broad set of interests dominates so much. And you can see that there are lots of things that you can see that in, but I think the most prominent one, or the easiest to understand, is over natural gas fracking, right? In our most recent election, the very notion. Now, again, fracking and fracking regulation is a complicated topic, right? And most, if not all, Pennsylvanians agree that if fracking is going to be done, that it needs to be done safely, and it needs to be done without impact to drinking water, et cetera. Right? Everybody can have that kind of broad agreement. But there are very different interpretations about whether fracking is good or bad, right? Or how important bigger issues like global warming are to our understanding of fracking. To such an extent that, one presidential candidate mentioning banning fracking, years ago in a debate kind of comes to define that person for a whole group of people as someone that is against their interests. Compare that to New York State, where fracking was effectively banned more than a decade ago. And in fact, that banning was enshrined first by the governor and then by the General Assembly, a couple of years ago, right? So I mean, there are plenty of people in New York State who would like to be able to sell the natural gas rights to their land. There are plenty, if you cross the New York Pennsylvania border, between Mansfield and Corning, you don't suddenly go to a magical land in which people's views of the landscape are fundamentally different from one another, right? They're not, right? If folks in Corning had their way, most likely you would be fracking in New York State. But you don't, right? Because of this legacy of development in a particular way that is different than that of Pennsylvania, right? So to kind of sum that up, Pennsylvanians care about their land. There are some things that all Pennsylvanians can agree on, and I think clean drinking water is one of them, right? But in order to get good public policies done in Pennsylvania, you have to build coalitions, and those coalitions have to recognize that there are winners and losers, and sort of convince people with different perspectives that their interests are aligned in a way that you do not have to do in New York State, right? And so at those moments, the 1890s, the late 60s, 1970s, right? They did align, right? We have a legacy of alignment, and we still have a legacy even in the 1980s and 1990s. We have a number of really, really important environmental policies that are passed. The creation and funding of rails to trails, which has become such an important part of Pennsylvania's identity, right? Agricultural easements for preserving farmland, right? There are places where these things align, right? But you have to work a whole hell of a lot harder at it in Pennsylvania than you do in some place like New York State, where the environmental framework is different, and that has caused over time the public policy and the political framework to be different. And I think that that's one of the things that I really wanted to show with this book was the possibility of good public policy in Pennsylvania, but also setting up a framework for understanding how to achieve it, and that dismissing one group's perspective as being wrong, well, it could be wrong, right? But illegitimate is not the way to get good public policy done in Pennsylvania. And regardless of whether you think it's legitimate or illegitimate, you cannot force things on people in Pennsylvania in a way that you can in some place like New York State. And that was kind of one of the big things, one of the big comparisons I set up in the book was that.
You mentioned
that was heavy. You remember, I'm an academic, right?
No, that was great. Thank you. You mentioned rails to trails. How else has Pennsylvania tried to clean up and reclaim our land following post-industrialization?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, and this is a kind of to take that into a bigger picture, we tend to separate the environmental movement and the historic preservation movement as kind of into separate buckets, much like we separate kind of forestry from urban renewal. For me, these two things, kind of historic preservation and environmental conservation, environmentalism, they have this overlap in lived landscapes, working landscapes, right? And for me, the most effective mechanism by which we can create meaning, right? Creating places where people want to live, where people have a sense of community, is by combining clean, healthy outdoor spaces with a sense of lived experience, a sense of a history of a place that often requires us to maintain some of that built infrastructure too, right? I mean, we often forget that, rails to trails are brownfields. They're semi-reclaimed industrial sites, right? And so for me, being able, as a historian, we do ourselves an injustice if we just see, things like rails to trails as being just, natural sites.
Yeah.
We need to be able to narrate and explain and tell the stories of these places so that folks who live there or who visit there can feel like they're a sense, they're part of something that has, kind of an authenticity, right? A feeling of belonging to it. And so for me, thinking about the ways in which we go about urban renewal, downtown renewal, those sorts of things, simply kind of erasing the past and pretending like we're just building something new, you lose a lot when you do that. And those tend to not be the places that people really associate with and want to live in. They want to live in a place that kind of combines an authentic built environment with a healthy natural environment.
Nice, easy question. What's the future of Penn's Woods?
On the one hand, I say it's a question mark. And I say that because we truly are facing existential challenges. Now, and I say that kind of knowing that our ancestors felt the same way, right? I mean, staring at a denuded hillside or staring at a massive fish kill after an acid mine drainage incident, right? Looking at the fires of Centralia, right? I mean, like we have faced existential threats before. Global warming, I think the difference with global warming is that it is kind of simultaneously everywhere and nowhere all at once. And kind of the very abstractness of it makes it difficult to build effective coalitions, right? And we're facing an existential threat. I mean, many of the things that we value the most about Pennsylvania are dependent upon a stability, a broader stability that is not going to exist over the next 100 years, right? And so the future of Penn Woods has to be one. It has to be one where we can find common ground over preserving the landscapes and the peoples, right? The communities that we together value the most. And that is going to be difficult, right? It's going to require hard choices, and it's going to require the kind of coalition building that our politics have not encouraged really for the last decade or so. I am optimistic, in part because I like to be able to sleep at night. But I'm also optimistic because as a historian, I know the animosity and the frustration, and the hopelessness that our ancestors felt. And yet we're able to come through and deliver on a landscape that we all, an environment that we all love and cherish today. And I feel that we owe it to the next generation to figure things out for them. And so the future of Penn's Woods, to me, looks a lot like the past in that there will be winners and losers. But if we can when we find common ground to unite people over this love of Pennsylvania, I feel very confident that we can overcome the challenges that we're facing.
Where can people purchase the book?
I appreciate you asking that. So you can get it in all of the places that you normally buy a book if you want to buy things online. I would encourage your listeners, if they want to go to an online place to buy it, is to go to paconservationheritage.org. All of the proceeds of the book bought through paconservationheritage.org they will go to the Pennsylvania Parks and Forests Foundation, and buying the book directly supports our forest, the forests and the parks that we all love. While you're there at paconservationheritage.org, you can take a look. I talked with you a little bit about the different phases of the Conservation Heritage Project. There is enormous amounts of information, including links to amazing documentaries on Joseph Rothrock, on Ralph Abel, on Mira Lloyd Dock, on environmental justice, that were produced by the Conservation Heritage Project and WITF Media over the last decade. That's really kind of, I think, the launching pad for folks to learn more about Pennsylvania's environmental history and its conservation heroes, and buying the book from there supports the Parks and Forest Foundation.
Allen, thanks so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christian. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and it was my honor to be able to join you on it today. Thanks.
I want to thank my guest, Allen Dieterich-Ward, for joining the podcast. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Meta for more information about upcoming episodes. You can support the podcast by buying merch at hemlockstohellbenders.com, or you can click support the show in the podcast description to provide a monthly donation. This has been Hemlocks to Hellbenders. I'll see you out there. Hosting, production, and editing by Christian Alexanderson. Music by John Sauer. Graphics by Matt Davis.